Prepare to die.
From a supervillain bent on world domination to a corrupt pink teddy bear/dictator, today we're ranking every Pixar villain from worst to best on the WickedBinge Tier List. And without further ado, we're gonna start at the bottom. This is the D tier. Strangely, our choice for the worst Pixar villain actually comes from what we consider to be one of the best Pixar movies, Terry from Soul. Terry is a perfectionistic accountant from the great beyond, who's tasked with making sure the count of souls is correct. And it's actually far more important to Terry herself than anyone else. So naturally, when Joe is sent to the great before, Terry works tooth and nail to bring him back and thus gain recognition for just how good she is at her job.
I'm the accountant and I'm here to bring you out. Oh, you're not Joe Gardner.
So why do we place Terry at the bottom of our list? Well, it's simple. She's barely a villain in the first place. At the end of the day, she's an agent of the afterlife who's just doing her job. In this case, that just happens to be bringing a soul back to the afterlife where it belongs. And if that weren't enough, she barely gets any screen time in the movie, so we aren't particularly endeared to her either. She's not a bad character, but as the closest thing to an antagonist the movie has, we have to call her the most unimpressive. But let's move on to a character who's a bit more threatening. Thunderclap from The Good Dinosaur. Thunderclap is an unhinged hunter who has a fascination with storms and the destruction they leave in their wake. After being caught in the eye of a storm, Thunderclap overcame his own fears. But this wouldn't be for the better, as it would make him a callous creature who takes and eats whatever he wants as he sees fit.
You think you can mess with me?
Now, I guess Thunderclap is a serviceable villain, but he's also just kind of there. There isn't really any interesting motive to speak of with this guy, nor is he enough of a threat to make up for that. He's just a mean pterodactyl who happens to be the bad guy of a movie that, let's be real, many people haven't even watched. Now, rounding out our D tier is Mor'Du. Pixar villains come in all shapes and sizes. There's old foes, new foes, and say it with us,
Even a bear.
But Mor'Du is no ordinary bear. Born the eldest of 4 princes, he was gifted with a great strength, and alongside his brothers, was promised a share of the kingdom upon his father's passing. But this wasn't enough for Mor'Du though, so he challenged his brothers to battle and took the crown for himself by force using a potion. The potion granted him great strength, but at the cost of his soul. Oh, and he also turns into a bear. Despite having a really cool origin story, which is more than we can say about any of the other villains thus far, Mor'Du doesn't really have a lot going on in terms of actual screen presence. Sure, he's pretty scary and tough, but he is, just a bear. Without that fairy tale backing him, he's just not all that interesting. But as he stands, he does top off the lowest category we have today. But these next villains, while flawed, still manage to be decent and serviceable enough. These are the C tier villains. While most would probably and justifiably place him in dead last, Sir Miles Axelrod from Cars 2 kicks off our C tier category. And really, Axelrod is a lot like Cars 2 in general. Is he almost objectively the worst villain in this studio's history? Yeah, pretty much. His plan is so incredibly convoluted, making a new alternative fuel called Allanol to sell to cars via a World Cup racing tournament. Except he can also blow some of them up with this fuel that he himself made to make it look bad.
There is no way my fuel caused these cars to flame out.
Then he's going to sell his gasoline so that everyone will go back to giving him money for gas from his own oil reserve, even though cars already use gas. And all of this is naturally for the sake of giving his fellow lemons more respect. Now, I know what you're thinking. Couldn't he just keep selling Allanol if it doesn't explode unless you make it? And further still, if his plan was to sell more gasoline, why even make Allanol in the first place? If you have answers to any of these questions, let me know, because I'm still very confused. But like the movie in general, while Miles' plan is actually stupid, it's so much so that it somehow circles back around to being entertaining. If nothing else, at least this guy is an actual threat. And come on, it's a talking car who's also a mass terrorist. So some points for creativity, right? Next up is an official supervillain, Screenslaver, aka Evelyn Deaver. Now, Incredibles 2 as a movie and Evelyn Deaver as a villain both get a pretty bad rap. The reasoning is fair enough, in that while neither are necessarily bad, they kinda pale in comparison to the first Incredibles movie. We'll start with what's obvious. First, the fact that Evelyn Deaver is the screenslaver's true identity. There's really no reason Screenslaver needed to be a twist villain, so it would have been cooler to keep their identity as secret until the very end, or at least make it a little less blatantly obvious. And while it's been said to death, we can't ignore the fact that she goes on a whole villain monologue without a lick of irony.
The fact that you saved me doesn't make you right.
The exact trope Syndrome made fun of in the first movie. That said, some of the motives behind Screenslaver's character are interesting. She learned the hard way from a young age that superheroes can't always be relied on to save the day. And as a result, she resents the society that's come to rely upon them too much. It's a good message about the dangers of complacency and makes Evelyn a villain who, while certainly evil, isn't completely heartless or ill-intentioned. In a way, she wanted to change society for the better. This character really had the potential to be great, and like the movie she comes from, ended up being just okay. Now hide your favorite toys, because next up is Big Al. He's the owner and proprietor of Al's Toy Barn, an obsessive collector who gives anyone who enjoys the hobby a bad name. He steals a cowboy doll belonging to a literal child from a garage sale, with the intent to sell him for a major profit.
It's like printing my own money.
While not malicious to our main characters, he does threaten to get Woody sent away from Andy for good. To anyone else, this guy would be basically harmless, but to helpless toys, he is an absolute menace. And he's not the last one who fits that description. Next up is Gabby Gabby from Toy Story 4. While it's by far the weakest of the Toy Story films, Toy Story 4 still manages to have a decent antagonist, albeit not a super threatening one. Like many newer Disney and Pixar movies, Toy Story 4 opts for the more sympathetic villain route by making its villain one who wants to take Woody's voice box, since hers is damaged.
Wow, you need to fix that.
This is to help her find a child who will want her, since she's never had an owner before. It's touching, right? Yeah, but let's get into her less touching deeds. Gabby holds Forky hostage, refusing to return him to Woody unless the latter gives her his voice box. That's basically like holding a mentally ill person hostage, offering their safe return in exchange for one of their friend's organs, which is actually pretty hardcore. We're all for a sympathetic motive, to an extent, but the way Gabby is written doesn't lean far enough into just how messed up her deeds are, which sadly loses her some points. So remember kids, if you harvest someone's organs in real life, don't expect them to be as polite as Woody was about it. And rounding out our C tier, we have Ercole Visconti from Luka. Ercole is a step above the average bully. He's a 16-year-old who picks on kids significantly younger than himself and treats everyone, even his alleged friends, like garbage. It's easy to root against this guy, given just how unlikable he is, which, in a villain, is a pretty good character trait to have. Upon learning that Luka is a sea monster, Ercole is fully willing to actively kill him, just in case you were wondering if he was truly a bad guy or just kind of a jerk. It's time for you to stop pushing kids around and start pushing yourself into therapy, buddy. Remember, you're only 2 years away from being tried as an adult. That said, he does perfectly fill that love-to-hate archetype, and is quite entertaining. Next up, we have the villains who are pretty good, but maybe not quite the first ones that come to mind when you think of Pixar's heavy hitters. These are the B-tier villains. Much like the movie he hails from, Jackson Storm is actually kind of good. Cars 3 is all about Lightning McQueen slowly learning and accepting that he's not the race car he used to be. He's not as fast as he once was, and no matter how hard he tries, his old ways of racing can't beat the new innovations the world has seen since his prime. Jackson, as an antagonist, illustrates these themes perfectly. He makes his debut by absolutely throttling Lightning and messing with his head about how he's old news now.
You have no idea what a pleasure it is for me to finally beat you.
While not outright evil, Jackson is a great foil to Lightning, forcing him to accept his fate and help train the next generation of racers, though he himself isn't really endearing, which places him beneath the remaining villains. For the best villain in the Cars franchise, we have the first, Chick Hicks. Every great racer needs a rival, and Chick Hicks fulfills that role for Lightning McQueen. Chick will stop at nothing to win, and if that means bullying or even sabotaging his fellow racers, so be it.
That was some pretty darn nice racing out there.
Fight me!
While Chick isn't a pure evil character by any means, he is a fun character who works effectively as a rival to Lightning. He is a total jerk with an ego the size of the moon, kinda like how Lightning is at first, but without any of the growth. Also, fun fact, in the Cars comics, which exist apparently, Chick Hicks was revealed to once be a decent guy who helped a less skilled car win a race, but sadly he was told off by his father, who always placed winning above everything else. If that were in the movie, he'd probably be ranked higher, but either way, respect for that surprisingly heartfelt backstory. Maybe he's not all bad, even if his role as a lightning-hating commentator in the third movie is a bit petty. Our next entry is Roar Omega Roar from Monsters University. They're the most popular frat boys at Monsters University, and like some of the other lower stakes villains, they reflect the themes of the movie really well. These guys rival both Mike and Sully, being smarter than Sully and scarier than Mike. They aren't brilliant or super threatening antagonists, but they really do get the job done while making sure you root against them. And given the more lighthearted tone of the movie, that's more than enough. Bane to Fish Everywhere, next is Darla from Finding Nemo. This kid is an absolute menace, and at the same time, probably the most innocent, quote, villain on our list. She's the closest thing the movie has to any sort of antagonist, having a reputation for killing all of her pet fish due to neglect or recklessness.
Let's see those pearly whites.
I'm a piranha.
This is fair enough from such a young kid, though someone should really tell Dr. Sherman that his niece needs therapy. But the fact remains that she's only a threat because of her sheer size compared to the fish, and her lack of fully developed cognitive functions. She's not a bad kid, just as long as you're not a fish. A villain like that comes off as both hilarious and threatening, which is a tough balance to strike. Let's talk about Zurg, specifically his iteration in Lightyear. And one of the few actually interesting parts of this whole movie. It turns out that Zurg is actually an alternate timeline version of Buzz, one who, desperate to fix his past mistake, wasted his days figuring out how to get back to before he'd made it in the first place.
What's happening to you never happened to me.
While it's nothing we've never seen before, the villain being an ominous reflection of who the hero could become is often an important part of storytelling, not to mention just how much of a threat he was. Also, if nothing else, the fight between these two at the end was pretty cool.
Not today, Zurg.
Moving on to a sympathetic villain, we have Ming Lee from Turning Red. Of all the villains in Pixar's history, few of the conflicts they create are as relatable to the average viewer as that of Ming Lee. Helicopter parents can be trouble after all, and from following her daughter at school to forcing her to bottle up her red panda transformation, Ming's controlling nature threatens to push her daughter to her breaking point.
No, absolutely not.
We'd be hesitant to consider her a valid entry for this list if it weren't for the fact that she attacks the concert venue May sneaks off to, endangering countless lives, including her daughter's, in the process. It's revealed that Ming herself has some generational trauma, which adds a deeper layer to her character, and honestly makes her one of the more realistic Pixar villains. Now, rounding out our B tier, we have the original Pixar villain, Sid from the first Toy Story. Sid is a kid who enjoys torturing his, and other kids' toys in various creative ways. It's a violent way to play, sure, but from his perspective, he is still just playing. That doesn't stop Woody from presumably scaring him for life by having all the toys call him out. And from his perspective, that too was reasonable.
So play nice.
Sid may not be a true evildoer or even much of a threat to anyone who isn't a toy, but he is a force that the toys were definitely right to fear. Thankfully, it seems like he's found a decent path in life. In Toy Story 3, he makes a cameo as a garbage man, showing that he's willing to take on the unappreciated jobs that most people take for granted. Or maybe he just wants to find more thrown away toys to torture. Either way, here's hoping he's doing better these days. With Sid wrapped up, now we're getting to the really good villains. This is the A tier. Just outside of the top 10, we have The Incredibles' secondary antagonist, Mirage. While she's not the mastermind of the plan, we'll get to him later, Mirage is notable for being the one to successfully lure Mr. Incredible to a remote location so Syndrome and his robot could kill him. She may be a villain, but she's a villain with standards, and when Syndrome proves he doesn't value her life after she's threatened by Mr. Incredible, she frees him and ultimately helps him defeat Syndrome for good. In 10th place is Gusteau's wannabe successor, Chef Skinner. Anyone can cook, but it takes a real master chef to play the long game to usurp your deceased friend's restaurant and use his likeness to sell frozen dinners. As you can tell from that very specific analogy, our dear Chef Skinner will do whatever it takes to inherit Gusteau's, even to the point where he deliberately hides the fact that Linguini is his biological son. With how many money-hungry people are out there, Skinner is another one of Pixar's more realistic villains.
Welcome to hell.
His willingness to sabotage others and his overall strategic brilliance, all for the sake of maximizing profit, make him a force to be reckoned with. Adventure is out there, a statement that Charles Muntz knows all too well. He was once admired greatly for his world travels and discoveries, which only grew more and more as he entered old age. Unfortunately, when he brought back the skeleton of a rare bird, it was labeled a fake, so he set out never to return until he had the bird with him. His time away was not nice to his psyche, to say the least. He's implied to have killed several travelers and planned to do the same to Carl and Russell. Whatever it takes, he was determined to get his hands on that bird and clear his name.
Just wait till they get a look at you.
Charles is a disturbing man because, unlike many other Pixar foes, even human ones like Skinner and Ercoli, Charles has no quirky, fun characteristics. He's just a deeply broken, unstable man who's desperate to repair the world's view of himself. There's definitely a lot of depth there, and we kind of feel bad for him in a way. Sort of. Now, we're gonna add one more character to the can we really count this guy as a villain pile. Otto from WALL-E. Since Otto is just a computer programmed to follow its directive, consider this more of an entry for WALL-E's conflict itself. That is, by and large. When the Earth becomes uninhabitable due to excessive waste, humanity is set out on the Axiom to explore space in total luxury, while the WALL-E bots clean up their mess. Literally. When Eva brings a sapling on board, Otto refuses to allow the captain to entertain the idea of going back home, even though, as they see now, they have a chance to start fresh. While Otto isn't malicious by any means, he's still keeping humanity from saving itself from complacency and ultimately destruction. It could honestly be seen as a metaphor for just how easy it is to take waste too far, even if it's not due to intentional harm so much as blissful ignorance. Anyway, enough existential stuff. Let's talk about something simpler, like a chubby prospector toy, Stinky Pete from Toy Story 2. When you think twist villain, you probably think of, a villain, a character who feigns kindness only to turn on the heroes at the very end. Stinky Pete is different. Rather than this simple but often effective process, this prospector does genuinely care about Woody, Jesse, and Bullseye, so much so that he'll stop at nothing to keep them together. Jesse's abandonment issues and paranoia of being locked up again make her a sympathetic character, whereas for Pete, who's been through it as well, but with the added bonus of being the one to keep the others feeling safe and happy, it turned him into a ruthless monster willing to kill if that's what it takes to have a good, happy life.
Let's not start off by pointing fingers, shall we?
He also pulled the strings in more ways than you would expect, like turning on the TV and foiling Woody's plan to take his arm back from Al, making him chock full of surprises. Now, rounding out the A tier is another twist villain, Ernesto de la Cruz from Coco. How ironic that Ernesto, the musician that Miguel looks up to more than anyone else, was the one who tore his family apart and made most of them hate music in the first place. De la Cruz is slowly but surely fleshed out throughout the movie, and as kind as he seems at first, there's a much more sinister side of his character. As it turns out, he poisoned Hector in order to steal his music as his own.
You have to be willing to do whatever it takes.
This led Coco to grow up without a father, and to her family refusing to allow the playing of music for years to come, resenting Hector for what they thought was him abandoning his family. The guy successfully fooled multiple generations into thinking Hector was a deadbeat dad when, in reality, it was Ernesto who was a deadbeat in general. Love him or hate him, that's a pretty solid description. On top of that, he's given a great amount of screen presence to establish just how beloved he is. Then more still to reveal just how sinister and twisted his heart actually was. And with that said, we're down to our last 5 villains, and it's time to reveal which ones we like the most. But rest assured that all of the S-tier villains are truly on another level. And starting out at number 5 is Hopper from A Bug's Life. Pixar's second movie was quite a shift in tone. Whereas Toy Story's main conflict was just a rocky friendship and a kid who likes to torture toys, A Bug's Life takes it up a notch by making its villain an actual dictator. Hopper is an absolute menace. He shows no compassion to anyone around him, not even to his own brother. To him, the ants are, well, ants. He's not even okay with letting one straggler go unpunished, because it'll threaten the hold they have on their colony already. And that's not our interpretation. He quite literally just straight up says that.
If you let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up.
Hopper manages to be a legitimately scary villain, forcing the ants to gather food for the grasshoppers and keeping their safety hanging in the balance. He's manipulative, ruthless, and honestly just scary. And beyond all that, he also has one of the most brutal deaths in any Pixar movie. Now, the bronze medal of villain greatness has to go to Lotso Huggenbear from Toy Story 3. We've suggested this before, but it's hard to make a villain who's both ruthless and threatening and sympathetic at the same time. Pixar has a pretty solid track record compared to many other studios in this regard, but they've never struck a chord quite as nicely as they did with Lotso. As friendly as he appears at first, Lotso runs Sunnyside Daycare behind the scenes. He's willing to interrogate, threaten, and even lobotomize toys into obeying him and giving him the information he wants.
Those caterpillar kids need someone to play with.
This is done because Lotso wants to be loved by the kids more than anything else. Ever since he was accidentally left behind by his owner, who he discovered to have gotten a new bear to replace him, he absolutely snapped and went from a loving companion to a ruthless dictator. And what makes him such a satisfying character is the fact that he's actually given a genuine shot at redemption. After everything he put Woody and friends through, they still save his life on the conveyor belt, trusting him to help them make it out. This is where he's offered a chance at redemption and to choose a better path, to which he says, nope, and turns it down in one of the most cruel ways imaginable. It makes his defeat all the more satisfying, despite how sad his origin story is. And that beautiful writing is enough for us to crown him as one of Pixar's greatest villains yet. But let's talk about who gets the silver medal for villain greatness. And no, we didn't miscount. We're giving it to both Waternoose and Randall from Monsters, Inc. Now, we were going to rank these guys separately, but they would have been right next to each other anyway. And since we're near the top three, we figured they'd both deserve credit for their strengths. Let's start with Randall. He's Sully's arch rival, and an absolutely terrifying one at that. I know the movie's called Monsters, Inc., but Randall isn't a fun, goofy monster like Sully or Mike. He's a terrifying creeper who will stop at nothing to win at all costs. No amount of sabotage or even straight-up torture is too far for Randall, shown by his invention of the Scream Extractor and his repeated attempts to kidnap Boo.
Looks like you're out of a job.
Waternoose, on the other hand, might not be as outwardly sinister as Randall. He has an appearance to keep up after all, and he even seems disgusted by many of Randall's deeds. That said, he's no saint by any means. He's willing to throw anyone under the bus if it means keeping his company running. And the guy has one of the most iconic lines in Pixar villain history.
I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let this company die.
And fun fact, apparently there was going to be a scene where Sully discovered a room full of child-sized cages, just in case you, for some reason, thought Waternoose was bluffing. And finally, the gold medal of supervillain greatness has to go to Syndrome from The Incredibles. Now, we really don't like to pick the top choice that everyone's already picking, but come on. Pixar has some amazing villains, but it's near undeniable that Syndrome is the absolute best. Understandable yet unjustified origin story? Check. Sick character design? Check. Proper foil to the main hero? Check. Absolute sicko with zero redeeming qualities? Total check. And finally, a terrifying motivation to destroy all supers except for his own technology. Check. He kills multiple supers in gruesome ways, and Mr. Incredible experiences his brutality firsthand. His goal is to wipe out supers so that nobody will be special, only to then come in to save the day as the only super remaining until the end of his days.
Looks like I've hit the jackpot!
Not only does he blow up a plane Bob is told carries his family, but he shows zero concern for Mirage when he threatens her as leverage. He has all the makings of a great villain. He's smart, powerful, and above all else, totally ruthless. You may get him to slip up in monologue, but a guy as ruthless as Syndrome isn't going to be taken lightly. Tack on some of the best action scenes in Pixar history, and you have just about the closest thing to a perfect superhero movie antagonist, and Pixar's greatest one to date.